In the cradle of civilization, between two ancient rivers, a people arose who would shape the very foundations of human history. The Sumerians. They gave us writing. They gave us mathematics. They gave us the wheel and the plow. But they also left us something else. Questions. Questions that have echoed through 6,000 years of human inquiry. Questions that modern science, with all its telescopes and laboratories and supercomputers, still cannot answer. Tonight, as you settle into the darkness and let the weight of the day slip away, we journey together to ancient Mesopotamia, to the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, to mysteries that whisper to us still across the vast chasm of time. Mystery 1. The Anunnaki Enigma. Let us begin where the Sumerians themselves began, with the gods. In the ancient texts, inscribed in wedge-shaped cuneiform upon tablets of clay, the Sumerians spoke of beings they called the Anunnaki. The name itself carries a weight of meaning that translates roughly to those who from heaven came, or princely offspring, depending on which scholar you consult. These were not abstract deities dwelling in some ethereal realm beyond human comprehension. No, the Sumerians described them with remarkable specificity as physical beings who walked among humanity, who built cities, who taught the arts of civilization, and who possessed technology that seemed, to ancient eyes, indistinguishable from magic. Consider for a moment the strangeness of this. Most ancient religions developed their gods gradually, through the slow accumulation of myth and metaphor over generations. The Greek Zeus evolved from Indo-European sky-father concepts. The Egyptian Ra emerged from solar worship traditions stretching back into prehistory. But the Anunnaki appear in Sumerian texts as if they simply arrived, fully formed, complete with hierarchies, technologies, and agendas. The tablets describe a pantheon of remarkable complexity. At its head sat Anu, the sky god, who dwelt in the heavens and rarely descended to earth. Below him, his children divided dominion over the world. Enlil, lord of the air and commander of the Anunnaki on earth, established his temple in the city of Nippur. Enki, lord of wisdom and the waters, made his home in the sacred city of Eridu, which the Sumerians believed was the first city ever built upon the earth. What troubles modern researchers is not the existence of these myths, for all ancient peoples had their gods. What troubles them is the consistency and the detail. The Anunnaki are described as requiring food, shelter, and rest. They experience emotions, engage in politics, and make mistakes. They intermarry with humans and produce offspring. They travel between heaven and earth in what the texts call mu, a word that has been variously translated as sky chambers, or that which rises straight up. The Sumerian scholar Zecharia Sitchin, whose work remains controversial yet influential, spent decades analyzing these texts and concluded that the Anunnaki were not mythological constructs at all, but memories of actual visitors from beyond our world. Mainstream archaeology dismisses such interpretations as pseudoscience, and indeed, the academic consensus holds that the Anunnaki were simply the Sumerian way of explaining natural forces and social hierarchies through divine metaphor. And yet, the questions linger. Why did the Sumerians describe their gods in such physical, almost biological terms? Why did they insist that these beings required laborers to work the earth, that they grew tired of toil, that they created humanity specifically to serve as workers in their stead? The tablet known as the Atrahasis describes the Anunnaki laboring in canals and mines until they rebelled against Enlil, demanding that a worker race be created to bear their burden. The god Enki, ever the clever one, proposed a solution: the creation of humanity through a mixture of clay and divine essence. This narrative, recorded in cuneiform perhaps 5,000 years ago, describes a creation event that echoes strangely with modern concepts. The clay could be metaphor, certainly, but the process described involves something the texts call tai, which means both rib and life. The Sumerians wrote that humanity was fashioned from this tai, this life essence, combined with the blood of a slain god. Science cannot explain why an ancient people would describe their origins in terms that seem to anticipate biological engineering. Science cannot tell us why the Sumerians were so certain that their gods were physical beings with physical needs, traveling in physical vehicles between physical locations. What science can tell us is that we do not fully understand what the Sumerians knew or how they came to know it. As you lie there in the darkness, consider this. Somewhere, beneath the sands of modern Iraq, there may still exist tablets we have not yet found, texts we have not yet translated, stories we have not yet heard. The Anunnaki remain an enigma, wrapped in cuneiform, buried beneath 6,000 years of silence. And in that silence, questions echo that science has not yet learned to answer. Mystery 2. The Sumerian King List. Among the most perplexing documents to survive from ancient Sumer is an artifact known as the Sumerian King List. This clay prism, along with several fragmentary copies discovered across Mesopotamia, records what the Sumerians believed to be a complete history of kingship from its very beginning, when, as the text states, kingship descended from heaven. The document reads almost like a historical chronicle. It lists kings by name, the cities where they ruled, and the duration of their reigns. The scholars have verified that many of the later kings on the list were indeed historical figures, rulers whose existence can be confirmed through other archaeological evidence. The cities mentioned are real cities whose ruins have been excavated. The sequence of dynasties matches what we know from other sources. And yet, the king list contains something that defies all rational explanation. The earliest kings on the list are recorded as having reigned for periods of time that strain credulity beyond its breaking point. The very first king, a man named Alulim, who ruled in the city of Eridu, is said to have sat upon his throne for 28,800 years. His successor, Al-Algar, reigned for 36,000 years. The list continues in this fashion, recording reign lengths of tens of thousands of years each, until it reaches a crucial turning point, the flood. After the flood, the text tells us, kingship descended from heaven once again, but now the reign lengths drop dramatically. Post-flood kings rule for mere centuries rather than millennia, and as the list progresses toward more recent history, the reign lengths become entirely reasonable, matching what we would expect from normal human lifespans. How do we explain this? The mainstream scholarly position holds that the antediluvian portion of the king list is purely mythological. The immense reign lengths are seen as symbolic, perhaps representing dynasties rather than individuals, or perhaps serving some numerological or religious purpose we no longer understand. The Sumerians, this view holds, were simply doing what many ancient peoples did, projecting their rulers backward into mythic time to grant them greater legitimacy. This explanation is sensible. It is reasonable, and yet it leaves certain questions unanswered. Why would the Sumerians record mythological kings with such specificity? They did not simply say, "The early kings ruled for a very long time." They provided exact numbers down to the year. They named specific cities where these kings held court. They recorded the passing of kingship from one city to another, as if documenting actual political transitions. The precision feels less like mythology and more like history being recorded by people who believed it to be true. Some researchers have proposed that the enormous reign lengths might represent a different calendar system, perhaps one based on lunar months rather than solar years. By this calculation, the antediluvian reign lengths become merely long rather than impossible. Others have suggested that the king list records not individual rulers, but family lines or tribal memories compressed into single figures. Still others wonder if perhaps the ancient Sumerians were recording something else entirely, something our modern frameworks are not equipped to comprehend. There is another possibility that hovers at the edges of respectable inquiry, one that connects to our earlier discussion of the Anunnaki. If the earliest kings were not fully human, if they carried within them some admixture of whatever the Sumerians meant by divine blood, might they have possessed lifespans that exceeded normal human limits? The Bible, which draws heavily on Mesopotamian traditions, records similarly extreme lifespans for the antediluvian patriarchs. Methuselah lived 969 years. Adam himself lived 930 years. After the flood, biblical lifespans decline rapidly, eventually reaching normal human lengths. The parallel is striking. Two independent textual traditions, both recording impossibly long-lived individuals before a great flood, both recording a dramatic reduction in lifespans afterward. Coincidence? Cultural borrowing? Or a shared memory of something that actually occurred in the deep past? Science cannot answer these questions. Archaeology can verify that the later portions of the king list are historically accurate. It can confirm that the Sumerians genuinely believed what they recorded. But it cannot explain why they believed it, or what truth, if any, lies buried beneath those astronomical numbers. The Sumerian king list sits today in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, a small clay prism covered in tiny cuneiform wedges. It has been translated, analyzed, debated, and dismissed. And still, it keeps its secrets. Still, it challenges us to explain how an ancient civilization could simultaneously produce verifiable history and impossible mythology, recorded in exactly the same format, with exactly the same precision, as if both were equally true. Mystery 3. The Abzu and the underground waters. Beneath the surface of the earth, the Sumerians believed, there existed a vast body of fresh water they called the Abzu. This was not merely groundwater in the geological sense we understand today. The Abzu was a primordial ocean, existing before the creation of the world, and it was the dwelling place of one of the most important and mysterious figures in the Sumerian pantheon, the god Enki. Picture this realm as the Sumerians imagined it. Below the soil and rock upon which they built their cities, below the foundations of their ziggurats and the beds of their canals, there lay a cosmic freshwater sea. The springs that bubbled up through the earth were windows into the Abzu. The marshes of southern Mesopotamia, where fresh water and salt water mingled in vast reed beds teeming with life, were places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. And at the center of it all, in the sacred city of Eridu, Enki had built his temple, a structure that served as a conduit between the realm above and the waters below. The Abzu was more than a mythological location. It was the source of all wisdom, all magic, all the secret knowledge that distinguished gods from mortals. Enki, dwelling within its depths, was the keeper of the Me, divine decrees that contained the fundamental principles of civilization itself. We will speak more of the Me shortly, for they constitute their own mystery. But first, let us contemplate the Abzu itself and why its existence in Sumerian cosmology presents such puzzles. Modern geology tells us that there are indeed vast reservoirs of water beneath the Earth's surface. Aquifers hold quantities of fresh water that rival the great lakes and rivers above ground. In recent decades, scientists have discovered water-bearing minerals deep within the mantle, holding perhaps as much water as all the world's oceans combined. The ancient Sumerian intuition of a great underground water source was, in a sense, correct. But how did they know? The Sumerians lived in a land of two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, flowing through an otherwise arid landscape. They understood irrigation and groundwater in practical terms. They dug wells and built canals. Yet their concept of the Abzu went far beyond mere hydrology. They described it as the place where creation itself began, where the fundamental forces of the universe were stored, where the gods themselves retreated when they wished to consult the deepest mysteries of existence. The connection between water and wisdom, between depth and knowledge, runs through Sumerian thought like an underground river runs through limestone. Enki, lord of the Abzu, was also lord of all arts and crafts, all sciences and magics. To descend into the waters was to access truth unavailable on the surface. The Abzu was not just below the earth in physical terms. It was below reality in metaphysical terms, a foundation upon which the visible world was built. Some scholars have suggested that the Abzu represents the Sumerian understanding of the unconscious mind, a repository of knowledge and power that lies beneath our everyday awareness. Others see it as a cosmological model, an attempt to explain where the universe came from before there was a universe. Still others wonder if the Sumerians possessed some genuine insight into the structure of reality that we have lost or not yet rediscovered. The rituals performed at Eridu, at the temple of Enki that stood at the edge of the marshes, were designed to open communication with the Abzu. Priests descended into pools of water, seeking visions and wisdom. Offerings were cast into springs and wells, gifts for the powers below. The entire religious apparatus of Sumerian civilization was oriented, in part, around maintaining proper relationship with this underground realm and its divine inhabitant. What did they experience in those rituals? What visions came to them from the depths? The texts describe Enki speaking to priests and kings through dreams and trances, granting them knowledge they could not have obtained through ordinary means. The skeptical mind dismisses such accounts as religious fantasy. But the Sumerians built a civilization on what they learned, a civilization of unprecedented sophistication, appearing suddenly in a land that had known only simple farming villages before. The Abzu remains a mystery because it sits at the intersection of mythology and reality in ways we cannot fully disentangle. The underground waters are real. The human sense that wisdom lies below the surface of things is real. The Sumerian achievements that allegedly flowed from their connection to Enki and his domain are real. What we cannot determine is the nature of the relationship between these realities, the mechanism by which an ancient people tapped into something that allowed them to create the foundations of civilization. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you too can imagine those ancient priests descending into darkened chambers where sacred pools reflected torchlight. Imagine the silence beneath the earth, the sense of vast spaces filled with water, the feeling that knowledge older than humanity waited there, are patient and eternal, willing to speak to those who knew how to listen. Mystery 4. The Me Tablets. We spoke briefly of the Me, those divine decrees held by Enki in the depths of the Abzu. Now let us turn our attention fully to this concept, for it may be the strangest and most intriguing element in all of Sumerian thought. The Me were not physical tablets in the ordinary sense, yet they were described as objects that could be held, carried, stolen, and transferred from one being to another. They were not laws in the way we understand laws, yet they governed everything from the movements of stars to the proper way to play a musical instrument. They were not magical spells, yet possession of them granted the holder extraordinary powers. The Me were, in essence, the source code of reality itself, the fundamental programs that made civilization possible. The texts enumerate hundreds of these decrees. Among them, we find the Me for kingship and the Me for priesthood. There are Me for truth and Me for descent into the underworld. There are Me for the craft of the smith and the art of the scribe. There are Me for sexual intercourse and for the kindling of strife. There are Me for the troubled heart and for the rejoicing heart. Every human activity, every natural phenomenon, every aspect of divine and mortal existence had its corresponding Me, and all of them were kept in the Abzu under Enki's watchful care. One of the most famous myths in Sumerian literature tells how the goddess Inanna traveled to Eridu to obtain the Me from Enki. Through a combination of charm and cunning, aided perhaps by the great quantities of beer she plied upon her host, Inanna convinced Enki to gift her with the Me. She loaded them into her boat and departed for her own city of Uruk. When Enki sobered and realized what he had done, he sent fearsome monsters to retrieve the Me, but Inanna outwitted each one and arrived safely home with her divine cargo. The Me, once transferred to Uruk, brought that city greatness and power. This myth can be read as a political allegory, explaining how cultural supremacy passed from the ancient holy city of Eridu to the rising power of Uruk. But such a reading does not exhaust its meaning, for the Me themselves remain unexplained. What kind of object is a decree for kingship? What does it mean to carry the craft of the smith in a boat? The Sumerians wrote of these things as if they made perfect sense, as if everyone understood what the Me were and how they worked. But we, reading their words across 5,000 years of separation, find ourselves puzzled. Some scholars have suggested that the Me represent a sophisticated understanding of cultural transmission, the way that skills, knowledge, and social structures pass from one generation or one society to another. By this reading, the Me are metaphors for what we might call memes, or cultural technologies, the building blocks of civilization understood as things that can be learned, taught, and transferred. Others have noted that the Me seem to anticipate certain concepts from information theory and computer science. The idea that reality operates according to fundamental programs, that complex phenomena emerge from simple underlying rules. That knowledge can be encoded in transferable forms. These notions feel surprisingly modern. Did the Sumerians intuit something about the nature of reality that we are only now beginning to understand through mathematics and physics? There is also the question of where the me came from in the first place. The texts state that they existed before the creation of humanity, that they were part of the original equipment the Anunnaki brought with them when they descended from heaven. If we take the Sumerian accounts at face value, the me were not human inventions, but divine gifts, tools designed by beings more advanced than ourselves and granted to humanity to enable civilization. This is, of course, exactly the kind of ancient astronaut interpretation that mainstream scholarship rejects. And yet, the concept of the me resists easy dismissal. The Sumerians were not naive people spinning fantasies. They were practical engineers who built irrigation systems, sophisticated administrators who managed complex economies, careful observers who tracked the movements of planets. When they spoke of the me, they spoke with the same precision they brought to measuring fields or predicting eclipses. The me tablets, whatever they were, represented the Sumerian answer to a question that still haunts us. Where does civilization come from? How did humanity transition from scattered bands of hunter-gatherers to city builders, lawmakers, astronomers, and poets? The Sumerians said the answer lay in divine gifts, encoded in objects of power, stored in an underground realm of sacred waters. We say the answer lies in evolution, a cultural development, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge over time. Neither answer fully satisfies, and perhaps neither ever will. Mystery 5. The Mystery of Eridu. We have mentioned Eridu several times now, and properly so, for this city occupied a unique place in Sumerian consciousness. They believed it was the first city ever built upon the earth, the original settlement established by the gods themselves at the dawn of time. Archaeological investigation of the site has revealed something remarkable. The Sumerians may have been right. Eridu lies today in southern Iraq, a mound of ruins rising from the flat desert landscape. When archaeologists first excavated the site in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they discovered a sequence of temples built one atop another, each layer older than the last, reaching back to the very beginnings of settled life in Mesopotamia. The lowest levels date to approximately 5400 BCE, making Eridu one of the oldest continuously occupied sites in human history. But it is not merely the age of Eridu that interests us. It is the nature of what was found there. The earliest levels of Eridu show a small shrine, a simple mud brick structure where offerings were made to the god Enki. Over succeeding generations, this shrine was rebuilt again and again, each iteration larger and more elaborate than the last, until it became a great temple complex rivaling any in Sumer. The Sumerians, it seems, maintained their memory of this place as sacred ground for thousands of years, returning century after century to rebuild and expand upon the original holy site. What drew them there? The location of Eridu is significant. It sits at the edge of what was once an extensive marshland, where the fresh waters of the Euphrates mingled with the salt waters of the Persian Gulf. In Sumerian cosmology, this meeting of sweet and salt waters was the very beginning of creation. The union of Abzu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water, from which all things emerged. Eridu was built at the geographical point where, according to Sumerian belief, the world itself began. Modern geology tells us that in ancient times, the Persian Gulf extended much further north than it does today. The coastline has changed dramatically over the millennia as rivers deposited sediment and the Gulf gradually retreated. When Eridu was founded, it may have been a coastal settlement, a town at the edge of the sea, precisely where the fresh waters and salt waters met. The Sumerians were not inventing mythology out of nothing. They were building upon actual geographical and hydrological conditions, encoding real observations into their cosmological frameworks. Yet the mystery of Eridu goes beyond its location. The artifacts found at the site suggest that from its very beginning, Eridu was a center of considerable sophistication. The pottery styles found there are distinct and elaborate. The temple architecture shows planning and skill beyond what we might expect from a simple early settlement. It is as if Eridu was founded not by primitive villagers slowly developing culture, but by people who already possessed significant knowledge and deliberately chose this location for reasons both practical and spiritual. The Sumerian texts describe Eridu as the place where Enki first established his earthly residence, building his temple, the Abzu, the house of the Abzu, directly above the underground waters. From this base, according to tradition, Enki taught the arts of civilization to humanity. The king lists place the first rulers at Eridu before kingship passed to other cities. The Sumerians looked back to Eridu the way later cultures would look back to Eden or Atlantis, as a place of origins, a source from which everything else flowed. Archaeology cannot tell us whether Enki actually walked the streets of Eridu in some prehistoric era. It cannot verify the claims made in Sumerian texts about divine instruction and cosmic significance. But it can tell us that the Sumerians were not entirely wrong when they pointed to Eridu as the beginning of their civilization. Something important did happen there, at the edge of the primordial waters in the distant past. A chain of events was set in motion that would eventually produce writing, mathematics, law, literature, and all the other elements we associate with human civilization. What triggered that chain? Who were the first inhabitants of Eridu, and what did they know? These questions remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The sands have claimed too much, and time has erased too many traces. But when you think of Eridu, think of a small shrine in the marshes, smoke rising from offerings made to an unseen god, and the slow, patient work of building something that would last for millennia. Think of the conviction those early people must have had that they were doing something important, something connected to powers greater than themselves. Think of how right they were, even if we cannot explain why. Mystery 6. The sudden emergence of Sumerian civilization. Perhaps the most troubling mystery of all when we consider ancient Sumer is not any single artifact or text, but rather the civilization itself, its very existence, its sudden appearance, its inexplicable sophistication. For when we look at the archaeological record, we find something that defies the gradual evolutionary model we expect from human cultural development. We find a civilization that seems to have emerged fully formed, like Athena springing from the head of Zeus. Before Sumer, the region we now call southern Mesopotamia was inhabited by simple farming communities. They grew crops, raised animals, made pottery, and lived in small villages of mud brick houses. Their culture was what archaeologists call Ubaid, a widespread tradition of similar settlements stretching across the Near East. There is nothing wrong with Ubaid culture. It represents a successful adaptation to the challenging environment of the region. but it shows no signs of writing, no complex mathematics, no monumental architecture, no literature, no astronomy. It is, in short, a Neolithic farming society, much like many others around the world at that time. And then, around 3500 BCE, everything changes. Within a remarkably short span of time, the Sumerian civilization appears, not as a gradual evolution from Ubaid antecedents, but as something qualitatively different, a quantum leap in human capability. The Sumerians possess writing, not primitive pictographs slowly developing toward abstraction, but a sophisticated cuneiform script capable of recording everything from legal contracts to epic poetry. They possess mathematics based on a sexagesimal system of extraordinary complexity. They possess astronomical knowledge that seems impossible without telescopes or centuries of careful observation. They possess engineering skills that allow them to build ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids rising to heights of over 100 feet. How does this happen? The standard archaeological explanation invokes urbanization and specialization. As populations concentrated in cities, the argument goes, the division of labor allowed some individuals to devote themselves entirely to intellectual pursuits. The pressures of managing large-scale irrigation systems and complex trade networks necessitated the development of writing and mathematics. Religion provided the motivation for monumental architecture. It all makes sense in theory, but the timeline does not quite work. Writing systems, as far as we understand their development elsewhere in the world, take centuries or millennia to evolve from simple symbols to complex scripts capable of recording abstract thought. The Sumerian system appears almost fully developed. Mathematical concepts that took other civilizations thousands of years to discover are present in the earliest Sumerian texts we possess. The astronomical knowledge recorded by Sumerian observers rivals what European scientists would not achieve until the Renaissance. Some researchers have proposed that we are simply missing evidence of a longer developmental period, that the crucial centuries during which these advances occurred left no archaeological traces that have yet been found. This is possible. It is even probable that we are missing significant evidence. But it requires us to assume that the development we cannot see followed patterns radically different from development we can see elsewhere. The Sumerians themselves had an explanation, of course. They said that the gods taught them. Enki, in particular, was credited with bringing the arts of civilization to humanity, instructing the first sages in the secrets of writing, mathematics, and all the other skills that distinguished civilized people from barbarians. The texts describe 7 sages, the Apkallu, who emerged from the sea in ancient times to teach humanity everything it needed to know. We need not take this literally to find it interesting. The Sumerians remembered their civilization as something given to them rather than something they developed on their own. They looked back not to centuries of gradual progress, but to a moment of revelation, a sudden gift of knowledge from sources beyond the ordinary human realm. Whatever actually happened in those crucial centuries around 3500 BCE, the Sumerians themselves did not experience it as normal cultural evolution. There is another possibility, one that hovers at the fringes of respectable inquiry. What if the Sumerians did not develop their civilization in Mesopotamia at all? What if they brought it with them from somewhere else, arriving in the land between the rivers as already civilized people, refugees perhaps from some other homeland destroyed by catastrophe. The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people, and their language has no known relatives belonging to no language family that linguists can identify. They seem to appear from nowhere, fully equipped with knowledge and skills that took other people's millennia to develop. We do not know where the Sumerians came from. We do not know why their civilization seems to burst forth so suddenly. These remain mysteries that science cannot explain, gaps in our understanding that speculation cannot fill. What we do know is that something extraordinary happened in southern Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago, and we are still living with the consequences. Mystery 7. The Epic of Gilgamesh and the Flood. Among the clay tablets recovered from the ruins of ancient Nineveh in the 19th century, archaeologists discovered fragments of a poem that would revolutionize our understanding of ancient literature and raise profound questions about the origins of one of humanity's most persistent stories. This was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of literature, and within its verses was contained an account of a great flood that would prove startlingly familiar to readers of the Bible. The story concerns a man named Utnapishtim, whom the gods warned of an impending deluge sent to destroy humanity. Following divine instructions, Utnapishtim built a great boat, sealed it with pitch, and loaded it with his family, craftsmen, and animals of every species. The rains came, the waters rose, and all life on earth was destroyed except for those preserved in the ark. After many days, the boat came to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim released birds to search for dry land. First a dove, which returned, then a swallow, which also returned, and finally a raven, which did not return, indicating that the waters had receded. Utnapishtim emerged, offered sacrifice to the gods, and was granted immortality as reward for his faithfulness. If this sounds familiar, it should. The parallels with the biblical story of Noah are so precise, so detailed, that they cannot be coincidental. The divine warning, the construction of the ark, the animals taken aboard, the birds sent forth, the mountain landing, the sacrificial offering. Point by point, the stories align in ways that demand explanation. The troubling fact for many 19th century scholars when this discovery was announced was that the Sumerian and later Babylonian versions of the flood story predated the biblical text by at least 1,000 years. The tablets containing the Gilgamesh epic were inscribed centuries before the earliest possible date for the composition of Genesis. If one story borrowed from another, it was not the Sumerians who borrowed from the Hebrews. This does not mean, as some have simplistically argued, that the Bible is merely a copy of older myths. The relationships between ancient texts are far more complex than simple copying. Both stories may derive from a common source now lost. Both may represent independent memories of an actual event. Both may draw on shared cultural traditions that predate either written version. The exact nature of the connection remains unclear, but the connection itself is undeniable. What are we to make of a flood story that appears in such similar form across multiple ancient cultures? The Sumerians told it, the Babylonians told it, the Hebrews told it, the Greeks told it in the story of Deucalion. Flood myths appear in cultures around the world, from India to China to the Americas. Some have suggested that these stories represent a collective memory of the end of the last ice age, when sea levels rose dramatically and coastal communities worldwide experienced catastrophic flooding. Others point to local events, the breaching of ice dams, or the sudden inundation of lowland areas by tsunamis or storm surges. The Sumerian version of the flood story, however, contains details that suggest something more specific. The texts describe the flood as a divine punishment, a deliberate decision by the gods to destroy humanity because they had become too numerous and too noisy. Enlil, the chief of the gods on earth, was disturbed by the clamor of human civilization and decreed that the race should be wiped out. Only through the intervention of Enki, who secretly warned Utnapishtim, was a remnant preserved. This is not a story about natural disaster. It is a story about divine intention, about powers beyond human comprehension who can create and destroy at will. About the fragile position of humanity in a cosmos populated by beings of vastly greater capability. Whether or not a historical flood lies behind these narratives, the theological and philosophical framework in which the Sumerians placed it tells us something important about how they understood their world. We live in the aftermath of whatever the flood was. All the civilizations of history, by the Sumerian account, descend from those who were saved in the ark. The post-flood world is different from the pre-flood world. Lifespans are shorter, gods are more distant, humanity must work harder to survive. Something was lost in the waters, some connection to an older and perhaps greater age. The flood marks a boundary between what was and what is, between the time of gods and the time of mortals. Science cannot tell us exactly what happened. Science can identify periods of dramatic climate change, episodes of flooding at local and regional scales, evidence of catastrophic inundations at various points in prehistory. But science cannot explain why the memory of these events took the particular form it did, why so many cultures tell essentially the same story, why the flood remains such a powerful presence in human consciousness even now, millennia after the waters receded. Mystery 8. Sumerian astronomy and the knowledge of planets. Let us turn our attention now to the heavens, for it is there that some of the most inexplicable aspects of Sumerian knowledge become apparent. The Sumerians were astronomers of remarkable sophistication, observers of the sky whose records and calculations would form the foundation of all subsequent astronomical traditions in the Western and Near Eastern worlds. But how they acquired their knowledge remains a puzzle. The Sumerians correctly identified 5 visible planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and tracked their movements across the sky with precision that would not be matched in Europe until the time of Copernicus and Kepler. They understood that these wandering stars, as they called them, followed regular paths, and they developed mathematical methods to predict their positions years or even centuries in advance. This knowledge passed to the Babylonians, who refined it further, and eventually to the Greeks, who incorporated it into their own astronomical systems. None of this is particularly mysterious. Patient observation over generations can reveal the patterns of planetary motion. The Sumerians had clear skies, a strong motivation to understand celestial phenomena for religious and agricultural purposes, and centuries of time in which to accumulate observations. Their astronomical achievements, while impressive, fall within the range of what dedicated observers can accomplish without advanced technology. But there are anomalies. Some researchers have claimed that Sumerian texts describe planets beyond those visible to the naked eye. the interpretation of certain terms and symbols has led to suggestions that the Sumerians knew of Uranus, Neptune, and even Pluto, planets not discovered by Western astronomers until 1781, 1846, and 1930, respectively. If true, this would be inexplicable, for these planets are invisible without telescopes, too dim and too distant to be detected by even the sharpest human eyes. The most famous proponent of this view was Zecharia Sitchin, who argued that the Sumerians possessed detailed knowledge of the outer solar system, including a 12th planet he called Nibiru. Mainstream scholars have largely rejected Sitchin's translations and interpretations, arguing that he systematically misread Sumerian texts to support his preconceived theories. The academic consensus holds that the Sumerians knew only the 5 classical planets, plus the Sun and Moon, giving them a total of 7 celestial bodies, not 12. And yet, certain elements of Sumerian cosmology remain difficult to explain. The Sumerians appear to have understood that the planets were worlds, physical objects moving through space, rather than mere lights in the sky. Their texts describe the planets as having surfaces, as being places where the gods dwelt. This is not necessarily remarkable. Many ancient peoples imagined the planets as divine residences. But the specificity of some Sumerian descriptions has given researchers pause. More puzzling still is the Sumerian understanding of the order of the planets and their relative distances from the Sun. Without sophisticated instruments, it is difficult to determine which planets are closer and which are farther from the central star. The Sumerians somehow got the order largely correct. They placed Mercury closest to the Sun, followed by Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, the sequence we know today from modern observation. How did they know this? The apparent brightness of a planet depends on many factors, including its size, its reflectivity, and its distance at any given time. Without being able to measure parallax or orbital periods with precision instruments, determining the true arrangement of the solar system is extraordinarily difficult. The Greeks debated the order of the planets for centuries without reaching consensus. The Sumerians appear to have simply known. Some have suggested that the Sumerians inherited their astronomical knowledge from an earlier, more advanced civilization now lost to history. Others, following Sitchin, argue that they received it from extraterrestrial visitors who possessed direct knowledge of the solar system. Still others believe that patient observation over thousands of years, combined with sophisticated mathematical inference, it could have yielded the correct results through entirely human means. Whatever the source, Sumerian astronomy represents one of humanity's great intellectual achievements and one of its great mysteries. The tablets they left behind record observations and calculations of remarkable accuracy. But they also hint at knowledge that seems beyond what observation alone could provide. When you look up at the night sky, at those same wandering stars the Sumerians watched 6,000 years ago, you participate in a tradition of cosmic inquiry that they began, and the questions they grappled with. What are these lights? Where did they come from? What do they mean? Remain as vital now as they were in ancient Eridu. Mystery 9. The Ziggurat technology. Rising from the flat Mesopotamian plain, the ziggurats of Sumer and Babylon have captured human imagination for millennia. These massive stepped pyramids, built of millions of mud bricks, were among the largest structures in the ancient world. The great Ziggurat of Ur, partially restored in the 20th century, still impresses visitors with its scale and precision. The Ziggurat of Babylon, described by ancient sources as one of the wonders of the world, may have inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. But what were they for? The conventional explanation holds that ziggurats were temples, platforms upon which shrines to the gods were built. The stepped structure represented a cosmic mountain, a meeting place between heaven and earth, where the divine and human realms intersected. Priests climbed the great staircases to perform rituals in the temple at the summit. The height of the structure brought them closer to the heavens where the gods dwelt. This is a sensible explanation, supported by inscriptions and textual evidence. The Sumerians themselves described their ziggurats in these terms. And yet, the engineering challenges involved in building these structures suggest a commitment that goes beyond mere symbolism. The great Ziggurat of Ur, built around 2100 BCE, measured approximately 210 by 150 feet at its base and originally rose to a height of perhaps 100 feet. It was constructed of solid mud brick with an outer layer of fired brick set in bitumen mortar. The logistics of such a project, the manufacturing of millions of bricks, the organization of labor, the solving of structural problems posed by such massive construction, represent an extraordinary investment of resources and effort. Why did the Sumerians build so large? There is evidence that ziggurats served practical as well as religious functions. The height of the structures would have made them useful as observation platforms, both for astronomical purposes and for surveying the surrounding landscape. Some researchers have suggested that the ziggurats played a role in Sumerian astronomy, providing elevated positions from which to observe celestial phenomena with greater clarity. The temples at their summits may have housed astronomical instruments and records. Others have proposed that ziggurats served as beacons, visible landmarks that could be seen for miles across the flat terrain of southern Mesopotamia. In a landscape without natural elevation, the ziggurats would have dominated the horizon, serving as navigation points for travelers and as symbols of urban power, visible to surrounding communities. The propaganda value of such structures should not be underestimated. A city that could build a ziggurat was demonstrating its wealth, organization, and divine favor. But there is another possibility, one that emerges from certain Sumerian texts and traditions. Some accounts suggest that the temples atop the ziggurats were not merely places of worship, but dwelling places for the gods themselves. The deity was believed to actually inhabit the temple, to descend from heaven and reside within the sacred space. The ziggurat was not just a cosmic mountain in metaphor. It was, in Sumerian understanding, an actual meeting point between worlds. If we take this literally, the ziggurats become something stranger than temples. They become, in essence, landing pads or docking stations, places designed to receive beings from the sky. The step structure, with its broad platforms, would provide suitable space for whatever vehicles the gods employed. The temple at the summit would serve as accommodation for divine visitors. The elaborate rituals performed there would be not merely symbolic worship, but actual protocols for receiving and interacting with non-human intelligences. This interpretation, associated with ancient astronaut theorists, is not accepted by mainstream archaeology. but it raises questions that conventional explanations do not fully address. Why did the Sumerians expend such enormous resources on structures that, by the standard interpretation, served mainly symbolic functions? Why did they insist that the gods literally dwelt in these temples? Why did they describe the ziggurats as connections between heaven and earth in such concrete physical terms? The ziggurats are gone now, mostly. Some survive as mounds of weathered brick, their original forms barely visible. Others have been partially restored, giving us a glimpse of their former glory. But the questions they pose remain. What did the Sumerians believe they were building? What experiences did they have atop those ancient platforms under the vast Mesopotamian sky? What led them to conclude that the gods could be brought down to earth through structures of mud and labor and faith? Mystery 10. The Sumerian Sexesimal system. Every time you check the clock, you are using a Sumerian invention. Every time you measure an angle, divide a circle, or navigate by degrees, you are employing a mathematical system developed in ancient Mesopotamia more than 4,000 years ago. The Sumerians counted in base 60, a sexagesimal system, and this choice has shaped human mathematics and timekeeping ever since. There are 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These numbers are not arbitrary. They derive directly from Sumerian mathematical practice, transmitted through Babylonian astronomers to the Greeks, and from the Greeks to us. The decimal system, based on 10, may be more intuitive. We have 10 fingers after all. But the sexagesimal system possesses certain mathematical advantages that the Sumerians recognized and exploited. 60 is a highly composite number, meaning it has more divisors than any smaller positive integer. It can be evenly divided by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60. This makes calculations involving fractions much simpler. In a base 10 system, dividing by 3 yields the awkward repeating decimal 0.333. In base 60, dividing by 3 yields a clean 20. Practical calculations. The dividing of fields, the measuring of goods, the timing of astronomical events become more elegant in the Sumerian system. But here is the mystery. How did the Sumerians arrive at this choice? Base 10 systems are easy to explain. Humans have 10 fingers. Counting on fingers is universal, and it naturally leads to a decimal system. Some cultures have used base 5 systems, corresponding to one hand, or base 20 systems, corresponding to fingers and toes. These choices make immediate sense in terms of human anatomy. Base 60 makes no such sense. We do not have 60 fingers. We do not naturally group things into sets of 60. The number has no obvious connection to human physical experience. Yet the Sumerians chose it as the foundation of their mathematics, and the advantages of this choice suggest that they understood number theory at a level we might not expect from an ancient people. Some scholars have proposed that the sexagesimal system emerged from the merger of 2 earlier systems, one based on 10 and one based on 6 or 12. The product of 10 and 6 is 60. If 2 different counting traditions were combined, the result might be a base 60 system. This is plausible, but it raises its own questions. Why 6? Why 12? And how did the Sumerians recognize that the combination would yield such a useful base? Others have suggested that astronomical observations drove the development of the sexagesimal system. The year has approximately 360 days, close to 60 times 6. The circle of the zodiac can be divided into 12 sections of 30 degrees each. Perhaps the Sumerians discovered 60 through their study of the heavens, finding it a natural unit for measuring celestial motions. There is also the possibility, entertained by some researchers, that the Sumerians did not develop the sexagesimal system at all, that they inherited it from some earlier civilization whose mathematical sophistication exceeded their own. If we accept the Sumerian accounts of receiving knowledge from the gods, from beings who came from the sky with advanced understanding already in hand, then the mathematical system might be part of that inheritance. Whatever the origin, the sexagesimal system represents a remarkable intellectual achievement. It is not merely a counting method, but a complete mathematical framework, capable of handling complex calculations with grace and efficiency. The Babylonians, inheriting and extending Sumerian mathematics, would use this system to solve quadratic equations, calculate square roots, and predict eclipses with extraordinary accuracy. We continue to use their numbers because they work. 4,000 years of alternatives have not displaced the 60-second minute or the 60-minute hour. The Sumerians gave us a gift of pure abstraction, a way of organizing numbers that transcends the particularities of their culture or ours, and we cannot fully explain how they came to give it. Mystery 11. The mystery of Ningish Zeda and the double helix. Among the many deities of the Sumerian pantheon, there is one whose iconography has provoked particular fascination among modern researchers. Ningish Zeda, a god associated with the underworld and with transformation, was depicted with a symbol that bears an uncanny resemblance to something the Sumerians could not possibly have known about: the double helix structure of DNA. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is the molecule that carries genetic information in all living organisms. Its structure, a twisted ladder of nucleotide bases, was discovered by James Watson and Francis Crick in 1953. Before that discovery, no one knew what DNA looked like. The double helix was a revelation, a key that unlocked the secrets of heredity and opened the door to modern molecular biology. Yet on Sumerian cylinder seals and carvings, dating to the 3rd millennium BCE, Ningish Zeda appears with two serpents intertwined around a central staff, their bodies coiling upward in a pattern that resembles nothing so much as the double helix. This symbol would later be adopted by the Greeks as the caduceus, the staff carried by Hermes, and would eventually become the symbol of medicine in the modern Western world. But its origins lie in Sumer, and its meaning remains uncertain. Was this resemblance a coincidence? The standard scholarly interpretation holds that the intertwined serpents represent various ideas: duality, the balance of opposites, the connection between the underworld and the upper world, the regenerative power symbolized by snakes shedding their skin. These are all plausible meanings, rooted in Sumerian religious thought and consistent with what we know of their symbolic vocabulary. But the specificity of the double helix shape remains striking. The serpents do not merely cross each other. They wind around a central axis in a pattern of repeating coils, exactly as the sugar-phosphate backbones of DNA wind around the molecule's central axis. The visual parallel is so precise that it has led some to wonder whether the Sumerians possessed knowledge of molecular biology that they encoded in religious symbolism. This suggestion is, of course, extraordinary. It it would require either that the Sumerians had technologies we know nothing about, capable of visualizing structures at the molecular level, or that they received information from sources who possessed such technologies. Neither possibility is supported by mainstream science, and both would require us to radically revise our understanding of ancient capabilities. And yet, the mystery persists. Ningish Zeda was a god of transformation, of boundaries, of passage between states of being. His realm was the underworld, the place of death and rebirth. The association with serpents, creatures that shed their skin and emerge renewed, reinforced his connection to cycles of death and regeneration. But the double helix symbol was not merely decorative. It was consistently associated with this particular deity, used in contexts that suggested deep significance. The Sumerians understood that life was transmitted from generation to generation. They knew about heredity in practical terms. They bred animals, selected plants, who recognized that children resembled parents. But the mechanism of this transmission, the molecular basis of inheritance, was hidden from them by the limitations of their technology. Or was it? We cannot know what the Sumerians truly intended when they carved those intertwined serpents. We cannot know whether they were recording scientific knowledge or merely creating aesthetically pleasing religious imagery. The symbol sits at the intersection of art, religion, and science, refusing to be reduced to any single explanation. What we can say is that the double helix has proven to be one of the most fundamental structures in nature, the key to understanding how life perpetuates itself. If the Sumerians somehow intuited this structure, if they encoded awareness of it in their religious symbolism, then they achieved something remarkable indeed. And if the resemblance is purely coincidental, then we have witnessed one of those strange correspondences that occasionally arise between human imagination and natural reality. A case of ancient artists accidentally depicting a truth they could not have known. Mystery 12. The Tablets of Destiny. We have spoken of the Me, those divine decrees that contain the programs of civilization. Now we must consider a related but distinct concept: the Tablets of Destiny, objects of supreme power that feature prominently in Sumerian and later Babylonian mythology. These tablets were not merely records or laws. They were, according to ancient texts, the source of supreme authority in the cosmos, and whoever possessed them held power over heaven and earth. The Tablets of Destiny appear in several major mythological narratives. In the Sumerian tradition, they were initially held by Enlil, chief of the gods on earth, as symbols of his supreme authority. Later, Babylonian texts describe the tablets being stolen by various antagonists: the bird-like Abzu in one tale, the chaos monster Tiamat in another, leading to cosmic crises that threaten the stability of the universe. The recovery of the tablets, typically by a divine hero, restores order and confirms the hero's supremacy. What were these tablets? On one level, they appear to be symbols of legitimate rule, similar to crowns or scepters in other cultures. The king who holds the Tablets of Destiny has the right to rule. The god who possesses them commands the obedience of other gods. They are markers of authority, tokens of power that can be transferred from one holder to another. But the texts suggest something more. The tablets are described as containing knowledge, as encoding the fundamental principles that govern reality. Whoever reads them knows the fate of all things. Whoever possesses them can decree what will be and what will not be. They are not merely symbols, but sources of actual power, objects that interface with the deepest structures of existence. The parallel with modern concepts of information and control is striking. We live in an age when information is power, when those who control data systems control economies and nations, when the algorithms that govern our digital lives determine what we see, what we know, what we believe. The tablets of destiny sound almost like a mythological anticipation of these realities, a recognition that knowledge, properly encoded and properly controlled, is the ultimate form of power. Some researchers have drawn connections between the tablets of destiny and the me discussed earlier. Both are described as sources of fundamental knowledge. Both grant power to their possessors. Both can be transferred from one holder to another. Perhaps they represent different aspects of the same underlying concept. The idea that reality operates according to encoded principles, and that access to these principles confers extraordinary capability. The theft of the Tablets of Destiny by Abzu, the lion-headed eagle, is particularly intriguing. The texts describe Abzu entering the sacred chamber where Enlil bathed, seizing the tablets and flying away to a remote mountain. The loss of the tablets throws the cosmos into chaos. The regular operation of the universe depends on their proper custody. Only when the hero Ninurta defeats Abzu and recovers the tablets is order restored. This is not merely a story about theft and recovery. It is a story about the fragility of cosmic order, about the thin margin between stability and chaos, about the supreme importance of whatever knowledge the tablets contained. The Sumerians clearly believed that reality itself depended on these objects, that the universe could not function properly without them. What could inspire such a belief? What experiences or knowledge led the Sumerians to conceive of cosmic power in these terms? The tablets remain mysterious, mentioned in ancient texts, but never described in detail that would allow us to understand their true nature. Were they actual objects, or perhaps encoded with information in some form we do not recognize? Were they purely symbolic, mythological expressions of abstract concepts about power and knowledge? Or were they something else entirely, something that transcends our categories of object and symbol? The tablets of destiny whisper to us across the millennia, hinting at secrets we cannot quite grasp. They tell us that the ancients understood something about the nature of power that we are perhaps only now beginning to rediscover. That ultimate authority resides not in physical strength, but in knowledge, not in armies, but in information, not in what is, but in what is known. Mystery 13. The disappearance of the Sumerian languages die. This is a fact of human history, as certain as the rise and fall of empires. But the death of Sumerian presents particular puzzles, for this language did not simply fade away. It entered a strange afterlife, continuing as a learned tongue for centuries after it ceased to be spoken by any living community. Sumerian is a language isolate. This means that linguists have been unable to connect it to any other known language family. It is not related to Semitic languages like Akkadian, Arabic, or Hebrew. It is not related to Indo-European languages like Sanskrit, Greek, or English. It is not related to any of the language families found in the ancient Near East or anywhere else. Sumerian stands alone, an orphan in the family tree of human speech. This isolation is itself mysterious. Languages usually have relatives. Even extinct languages can typically be grouped into families with surviving members. But Sumerian has no known siblings, no known parents, no known descendants. It appears in the historical record fully formed, serves as the vehicle for the first literate civilization, and then vanishes, leaving only the tablets upon which it was written. The Sumerians were conquered by Akkadian-speaking Semitic peoples sometime around 2300 BCE, when Sargon of Akkad established the first great Mesopotamian empire. From this point forward, Akkadian gradually replaced Sumerian as the everyday language of southern Mesopotamia. By approximately 2000 BCE, Sumerian was no longer spoken as a mother tongue. It had become a dead language. But here is where the story becomes strange. Sumerian did not simply disappear after it ceased to be spoken. It continued to be taught in schools, used in religious rituals, employed for learned compositions, and studied by scholars for nearly 2,000 more years. Akkadian scribes laboriously learned Sumerian grammar and vocabulary. They compiled dictionaries and grammatical texts. They copied and preserved Sumerian literary works. They used Sumerian phrases in religious ceremonies the way later Europeans would use Latin. Why would a conquering people go to such lengths to preserve the language of those they had conquered? The standard explanation involves prestige. Sumerian, as the language of the first literate civilization, carried enormous cultural weight. It was the language in which the oldest and most sacred texts had been written. To be educated was to know Sumerian. To worship properly was to use Sumerian formulas. The Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, who successively dominated Mesopotamia, all maintained this linguistic tradition, treating Sumerian as a repository of ancient wisdom that had to be preserved, even though no one spoke it anymore. But this explanation raises its own questions. Why was Sumerian considered so sacred? What made it worthy of such extraordinary preservation efforts? Other ancient languages were allowed to die without such elaborate memorialization. Why did Sumerian alone achieve this strange immortality? Some researchers have suggested that Sumerian was believed to be the original language of the gods, the tongue in which divine decrees were issued and cosmic truths were encoded. If the gods spoke Sumerian, then human priests needed to know Sumerian to communicate with them properly. Religious rituals required precise formulas that could only be effective in the divine language. To let Sumerian die completely would be to lose access to supernatural power. We cannot verify this suggestion, but it accords with what we know of Sumerian religious practice. The temples maintained schools where Sumerian was taught. The priests who performed rituals were trained in the ancient language. The very me, those divine programs of civilization, were presumably encoded in Sumerian. Perhaps the Mesopotamians maintained Sumerian because they believed their civilization depended upon it, that the knowledge preserved in those ancient texts was literally irreplaceable. Whatever the reason, Sumerian eventually did die, truly and finally, sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era. The last people who could read it passed away. The tablets were buried and forgotten. For nearly 2,000 years, Sumerian existed only as mysterious symbols on clay, undeciphered and unknown, waiting for archaeologists and linguists to bring it back from oblivion. We can read Sumerian now. We have dictionaries and grammars and extensive textual archives, but we can never hear it spoken as a living language, never know exactly how it sounded, never fully recover what was lost when the last Sumerian grandmother ceased to sing lullabies in her ancient tongue. The silence of Sumerian is itself a mystery, a reminder of how much of human heritage has been lost to the erosions of time. Mystery 14. The underworld of the Sumerians, Kur. Beneath the earth, below the waters of the Abzu, there existed in Sumerian cosmology a realm of shadow and dust. The underworld are known as Kur or Irkala. This was the land of the dead, where all mortals eventually descended, regardless of how they had lived their lives. The Sumerian underworld was not a place of punishment or reward. It was simply the destination, the inevitable end point of every human journey. The most famous description of Kur comes from the myth of Inanna's descent, one of the oldest and most powerful pieces of literature to survive from ancient Sumer. In this tale, the goddess Inanna, queen of heaven and earth, decides to visit the underworld, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. Her motives are unclear. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps ambition, perhaps some cosmic necessity. But her journey takes her through 7 gates, and at each gate she is required to remove an item of her royal regalia until she arrives before Ereshkigal naked and powerless. Ereshkigal strikes Inanna dead and hangs her corpse on a hook. Only through the intervention of Enki, who sends artificial beings to retrieve her, is Inanna restored to life and allowed to return to the upper world. But there is a price. Someone must take her place. Eventually, her consort Dumuzi is chosen, condemned to spend half of each year in the underworld. This myth echoes forward through history. The Greek story of Persephone, abducted by Hades and required to spend part of each year in the underworld, follows the same pattern. The theme of death and resurrection, of descent and return, appears in countless religious traditions. But the Sumerian version is the oldest we possess, the possible source from which later versions flowed. What did the Sumerians believe about death and the afterlife? The underworld they described was not a pleasant place, but neither was it a place of active torment. The dead existed as shades, pale reflections of their former selves, dwelling in dust and darkness. They ate clay and drank dirty water. They had no pleasure, no joy, no meaningful existence, only the grim continuation of being without purpose. It was, in essence, existence without life, presence without vitality. This vision of the afterlife is notably grim compared to later traditions. There is no heaven here, no paradise for the righteous. There is no selective punishment for the wicked. All mortals go to the same place, suffer the same fate, endure the same meaningless eternity. The Sumerian gods could grant temporary reprieve, as when Inanna was rescued, but no permanent escape from Kur was possible. Why did the Sumerians imagine such a bleak afterlife? Some scholars suggest that their vision reflected the harsh realities of Mesopotamian existence. The unpredictable floods, the difficult agriculture, the ever-present threat of war and disease. A culture accustomed to suffering might naturally imagine that suffering continued after death. Others propose that the underworld served as a contrast to the vital, engaging world above, reminding the living to appreciate their brief span of true existence. There is also the question of how the Sumerians knew so much about the underworld. The myths describe it in remarkable detail: its geography, its rulers, its gates and guardians, its customs and laws. Where did this knowledge come from? Near-death experiences? Shamanic journeys? Pure imagination? or something else, and some source of information about realms beyond ordinary perception? The underworld of the Sumerians connects to themes we have touched upon throughout this exploration. It relates to the Abzu, lying beneath the underground waters. It relates to the Me, for even the underworld had its divine decrees governing its operation. It relates to the cyclical nature of Sumerian thought, the understanding that what descends may also rise, that death is not absolutely final, that the boundaries between worlds can be crossed under certain conditions. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps the underworld seems less distant than it did before. Not as a literal place of clay and shadow, but as a metaphor for the unconscious, for the depths within us that we rarely visit but cannot escape. The Sumerians mapped these depths thousands of years ago, giving names and forms to experiences that remain universal. Their coup awaits us all in one form or another at the end of every human story. Mystery 15. The Return of Nibiru. We come at last to the most controversial mystery of all, one that has spawned countless books, documentaries, and internet discussions, that has been embraced by alternative researchers and dismissed by mainstream scientists, that hovers at the boundary between ancient wisdom and modern speculation. This is the mystery of Nibiru, the alleged 12th planet mentioned in Sumerian texts, which some believe will one day return to our solar system with catastrophic consequences. The Nibiru hypothesis was developed primarily by Zecharia Sitchin, whose 1976 book, The 12th Planet, launched a publishing phenomenon. According to Sitchin, the Sumerians described a planet beyond Pluto, following a highly elliptical orbit that brings it into the inner solar system only once every 3,600 years. This planet, called Nibiru, was supposedly the homeworld of the Anunnaki, the gods who came to Earth and created humanity. Sitchin claimed to have found evidence for Nibiru throughout Sumerian astronomical texts. He pointed to Cylinder Seal, Vive A243, now in the Berlin Museum, which appears to show a star surrounded by 11 other celestial bodies. If we count the Sun as one body and include Nibiru among the planets, we get 12. The 12 planets of the Sumerian system. He also cited textual references to celestial bodies and cosmic events that he interpreted as describing Nibiru's periodic passages through the solar system. Mainstream scholars have extensively critiqued Sitchin's work. They argue that his translations of Sumerian texts are often incorrect, that he reads modern scientific concepts into ancient religious metaphors, that the cylinder seal in question depicts a common stellar symbol rather than a diagram of the solar system. The consensus among Assyriologists and astronomers is that there is no credible evidence for a planet Nibiru in Sumerian sources or in modern astronomical observation. And yet, the idea persists. Part of its persistence derives from the genuine mysteries we have been exploring throughout this journey. The Sumerians did possess remarkable astronomical knowledge. They did describe celestial phenomena in ways that challenge conventional explanation. They did claim that their gods came from the heavens. If they knew things they should not have known about the 5 classical planets, might they also have known about bodies even further from the Sun? Modern astronomy has actually discovered objects in the outer solar system that were unknown in Sitchin's time. The Kuiper Belt, a region of icy bodies beyond Neptune, contains thousands of objects, some quite large. The dwarf planet Eris, discovered in 2005, is more massive than Pluto. And there is ongoing scientific speculation about Planet 9, a hypothetical large planet in the distant solar system whose gravitational influence might explain certain anomalies in the orbits of trans-Neptunian objects. None of these discoveries confirms Sitchin's specific claims. Planet 9, if it exists, does not match the description of Nibiru. It would not enter the inner solar system. It would not support life as we know it. It would not be home to intelligent beings. But they do suggest that the outer solar system remains incompletely mapped, that there may yet be large bodies awaiting discovery, that our picture of our cosmic neighborhood is not yet complete. The deeper appeal of the Nibiru hypothesis lies not in its astronomical specifics, but in what it represents. It embodies the hope that the Sumerians knew more than we give them credit for, that their myths encode scientific truths we have not yet recognized, that the ancient world held secrets that could revolutionize our understanding of our place in the cosmos. Whether or not there is a planet Nibiru, the questions the hypothesis raises remain powerful. How much did the ancients know? Where did their knowledge come from? What have we lost that they possessed? These questions do not have easy answers. The evidence is ambiguous, the interpretations contested, the truth hidden beneath layers of time and translation and wishful thinking. But the questions themselves are worth asking, worth pondering as you drift towards sleep, worth carrying with you into whatever dreams may come. And so we come to the end of our journey through the mysteries of ancient Sumer. We have traveled together from the cosmic heights where the Anunnaki dwelt to the shadowed depths of the underworld. We have examined clay tablets inscribed with impossible numbers and cylinder seals carved with enigmatic symbols. We have contemplated the sudden emergence of civilization and the slow death of a language. We have asked questions that have no easy answers and pondered possibilities that stretch the boundaries of what we think we know. What can we conclude from all we have explored? Perhaps only this: that the Sumerians were a remarkable people who achieved remarkable things, and that much of what they knew and believed remains beyond our full comprehension. They emerged from the mists of prehistory, already equipped with writing, mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. They built cities and empires. They created literature that still moves us across 5,000 years of separation. And they left behind mysteries that continue to challenge and intrigue us. Science has explained much about the ancient world. Archaeology has unearthed the physical remains of Sumerian civilization. Linguistics has decoded their language. History has reconstructed their political and social systems. But there remain gaps, anomalies, puzzles that resist easy solution. The king list with its impossible reign lengths. The astronomical knowledge that seems beyond observational capability. The religious imagery that anticipates modern discoveries. The confident claims about divine beings and cosmic origins. Perhaps these mysteries will one day be solved. Perhaps new discoveries will fill the gaps in our knowledge, will explain the anomalies, will reduce the wondrous to the ordinary. Or perhaps the mysteries will endure, will continue to whisper to us from the ancient tablets, will remind us that human history is stranger and deeper than we commonly assume. The Sumerians believed that kingship descended from heaven. They believed that the gods walked among them, teaching them the arts of civilization. They believed that the me, the divine programs, governed all aspects of reality. They believed that the Abzu held the secrets of existence. They believed that the dead descended to a realm of shadow from which there was no return. We need not share their beliefs to find them compelling. We need not accept their cosmology to appreciate its sophistication. We need not agree with alternative interpretations to acknowledge the genuine puzzles they address. What we can do is hold these mysteries with open minds and wondering hearts, recognizing that humanity's past contains depths we have not yet plumbed. As you settle now into sleep, carry with you the image of ancient Eridu rising at the edge of the marshes, its temple reaching toward the heavens, its priests chanting in a language no living voice has spoken for 2,000 years. Carry with you the sense of deep time, of civilizations rising and falling, of knowledge gained and lost and perhaps regained. Carry with you the questions that have no answers, for such questions are themselves a kind of gift, invitations to wonder, doorways to mystery. The Sumerians are gone. Their cities are ruins. Their gods are myths. Their language is silence. But they spoke to us across the ages through the tablets they buried in the earth, and what they said still echoes in our minds. We are their heirs, inheritors of the civilization they began, and their mysteries are our mysteries, waiting still for someone to understand. Rest now. Let the questions settle into comfortable uncertainty. Let the mysteries accompany you into dreams. And, perhaps, in that state between waking and sleeping, you will hear the whisper of ancient voices, speaking secrets in a tongue older than memory, telling stories that have waited 6,000 years for you to hear. Good night.